It is a pleasure to welcome you. This is Dr. Caitlyn McClure, and we're talking, of course, about the Northern Illinois Recovery Center. How long have you been involved?
I started in June of 2019 running a group a week,
Okay.
And one thing led to another, and I ended up a clinical director in December of 2019, so I've been around for a while.
And let's establish your street cred. A doctor on the name means you've actually done a little bit of work leading to this.
Yeah, I completed my doctorate in social work, which is a practical doctorate as opposed to a PhD. People don't know there's a difference. I was one of those kids who just ended up with a lot of folks around me who were struggling with their own mental health, and I found myself smack dab in the middle and trying to support all those people that I loved a lot throughout a lot of my formative years. And so one thing led to another, and I found that I was pretty good at it.
Yeah, well, that's apparent. And the department itself and how you interact with the other therapists and the work you do, it's different in a very good way at Northern Illinois Recovery. And we'll get into that, but I assume it's a very difficult job, but it's got to be really rewarding to go home at the end of the day knowing you're really making a difference.
Yeah, I think some of the most impactful moments are when alumni come back and they tell us their story of how they're doing. So it's neat to be surrounded by those stories of success.
Yeah, I talk often about my brother he's my hero. He has special needs, and he's 3 years older, but he just celebrated 20 years sober. And it's interesting because he is an AA guy. Not everybody is or has to be. But I looked at the coins, and I didn't realize that there's a 24-hour coin.
Yeah.
And the 24-hour coin, and I believe then it's 1 through 7 days maybe, and then you go to the monthly.
Yeah.
And then years. But the reason I bring that up is that first day is a really big deal, right?
Yeah. First day is that moment of making a choice and deciding to stick with it, right? Through 24 hours is sometimes the longest people have been sober in years, decades. And so making that very first step to say that I'm ready to do something different with my life is a really big turning point.
Throughout this, we want to make sure that you're aware of the phone number, 779-600-8440. It's northernillinoisrecovery.com. You do it differently at Northern Illinois Recovery. And one of the things I found interesting, too, in learning more about you guys, and you know I'm a fan of your founder, Chris, because he certainly was there, and now he's here and paying it forward by trying to help other people get on that path as well to really maximizing their lives. But as my brother struggled, and certainly through all the movies and the TV images, this is a 30-day thing. And it's 30 days and rinse and repeat. And if you don't succeed in 30 days, see you next time.
Yeah.
That's not the case anymore, right?
Yeah, no, we're finally starting to make some changes to the model and the approach to treatment.
28 days, was that
Yeah,
the
I
number?
know. It's classic, right? There's a movie of the same name.
Yeah.
So, everyone's in that mindset of 28 to 30 days will fix your whole life. And I think we've finally come to recognize that addiction's not just about using substances, right? It's understanding what's the underlying component that brought you to the place that you're at right now. And so that's oftentimes mental health or trauma or grief or these bigger things, and you can't unpack that in 28 to 30 days. And so we really look at a different model. We talk about extended care a lot, and so we see folks who are in care with us on average 90 to 120 days, and we still tell them you're scraping the surface. We look at how to set them up with really great aftercare and continued care, and the messaging throughout all of that is if you walk into a forest 5 miles, you got to walk 5 miles to get back out, right? It's not a quicker turnaround. And so I think that's something we embody throughout our care.
The other thing that you always hear is you got to hit rock bottom.
Yeah, I think that the old way, right, is that you've got to have had the worst experience you could ever have to really make a change. And we're finding more and more people who say, I think I got a problem with this, or I think this is going to get worse. And so they're engaging in treatment. They're seeking preventative help. They're seeking to get some support before it gets that bad. And I think that that's a really profound thing, that people have enough insight to say, I need to do something different before I hit rock bottom.
Those of us who are in codependent camp, we all feel that we can love them hard enough, we can guilt them hard enough, we can yell, we can shout, we can cry, we can do whatever, and that'll bring someone around. We know scientifically that's not the case. But maybe talk a little bit about the emotional piece of that, and that addicts aren't doing this to you with an intention of harming you, right?
I think that's one of the most difficult messages for family members, because it's a moment where I have to let go of control and admit that even for the better, I'm not in control, and I can't do that. We talk with our clients a lot about you can't fix, manage, and control your life and your recovery. That same message goes to family. And so sometimes the greatest gift we can give family is you're off the hook.
That's true.
It's not your problem to solve, and it's just your problem to love them through. And so sometimes that love looks different depending on the family and those relationships. But it really comes down to that person's got to make some choices. And sometimes they're highly motivated to start getting help and start getting the support they need because they really do love those family members that they've hurt along the way.
Yeah, and they want, if they've taken a step to come to you, they want their life.
Yeah.
They want to be able to live their life. They maybe don't know how they're going to get there, and they certainly are probably skeptical about the approach, not knowing you guys and how it's going to go. So how do you provide comfort when somebody makes that decision that they're in the right place and you're glad they're there?
I think one of the neat things about being a smaller organization is just the ability for everyone to know each other. We do a lot of things to bring the larger community together, so there's not these magical tracks where these are the only people you're going to interact with and they're the only ones who know what you've got going on. We really try to blend folks across all the different spectrums of care and the different levels of, time and recovery, because those stories are the ones that are impactful. Someone who says, oh man, I went through that 2 weeks ago, versus somebody, coming in from a meeting who says, I did that 20 years ago, can really have a big difference for folks.
Sure.
And I think the staff that we have are fantastic. I mean, they really do. The feedback we get all the time is like, there's just something different here. And when you ask people like, well, what does that mean? They're like, you guys you care. You care about us. You care about the journey we're on, and you want to see us succeed even after. And so you'll have alumni reach out with all these needs of, hey, I need a different therapy referral, or hey, I'm looking for a new meeting. And that continued contact is a big part because they've built relationships with us.
The not one-size-fits-all thing, I think, is an important emotional connection, too, for the addict coming in, because I think too many places have proven that if you come in and they go, here's our program, you're going to do it. And if you do it, you're going to be better. We also know that's not always true. So it's got to be a lot of work to have these different approaches that you can tailor to different people. How long does it take after you meet the person initially to have a sense of what they need?
I think it's always evolving, right? Because our understanding of ourselves is too. And so when folks are first coming in and they're sharing their story, we're able to take that information and connect them with the right care team, get them with the right therapist who can work into the niches that they really need. Somebody's coming in and they've got some really substantial trauma history or grief history. Like, I've got a therapist for that, right? And then that relationship that grows is able to help foster the track for their care, of the timing of their transitions in care, the groups specifically that they're participating in. And the other piece is we ask for their feedback. I think that's been a big change in the model, is that we're not the experts in someone else's life. We're the experts in a lot of models and interventions and supports, but they still know deep down what else is under there. And so when they can give you some feedback of, hey, I really think that I need some more skill building or some relationship focus, we can tailor their group schedule to meet those needs too that they identify.
Now, if you are a full-blown addict and you've lived your life in a very dangerous way like that, my personal experience, because I have a family full of them, is there are a few championship BSers in the bunch. There's no story you guys haven't heard. And the honesty that you need to give to these clients as they come in maybe isn't heard with open ears at first. How do you get over that wall?
I think a big part is continuing to show up for them, right? And that we're not the fact finders. We don't have to be the person who knows the ultimate truth of what all is happening, but figuring out how do we get them to a place of openness and safety that they can start sharing in a different kind of way than they're used to. Because it's a defense. They've had to live that way for a long time to protect whatever they've been protecting. And so to ask them to step out of that is a scary space. So I think we recognize that and meet them where they're at. And I think we do a really good job of having the hard conversations with compassion, where you can say like, hey, I can see where you're at with that. I can understand why you're headed that way. And they respond really well to that because it's just the truth.
Part of the therapy piece of this has to be getting out that life story that you talked about. Because, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert. But my own personal experience, again, with addicts is the blame part of it. That's their story at that time, and it's important to at least hear that while you try to guide them that the blame's not going to help anything. And you need to move forward. Is that part of the tack to take as well?
I think so, and I think that's the beauty of when you foster a really healthy community of folks in recovery, is that they're seeing their peers show up to groups and get honest and start exploring these really hard places. When you talk about shame and you talk about trauma and you talk about grief, and when you see someone else who is in your shoes, who has only been here 2, 3, 4 weeks, and they're doing it, you realize, man, there must be something. And that's the feedback they get is, I sat in these rooms and I just listened to everybody else talk, and I finally made a decision for myself that I had to talk about this stuff. And it's the example they set for each other in that healthy community, in that safe space, where then they're able to do the work they need to do.
So when clients are in, do new clients interact with people who are maybe 30 or 60 days down the road?
Between just the treatment models that we've got going on, we've got folks who are coming in at these higher levels of care, but they're still in groups with folks who have been in treatment 30, 60, 90 days. And so, like I said, they're able to see those stories. I think one of the other cool things is we have a lot of alumni who want to give back. And so they reach out and say, like, I want to share my story. And so we've got alumni coming in at least once a week who are coming in to share their story of recovery, who've got a year sober, and it's fresh enough, you know.
Sure.
I remember sitting in this room listening to Caitlyn's spiel on Monday mornings, just like you. It sounds the same, and here's my story on it, you know. And so it's neat to see them give back in that way because they want to. They've had some kind of experience, they've had some opportunity to heal, and they want to give back.
It can be maybe a little tough to hear at times because they may say, I don't like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't agree with it. It's not going to work for me. So how do you handle that wall?
I think one of the things that we've always done well has been responsive to the feedback, because that's the only thing that we can do is to heed that feedback instead of blindly following the workbook. We've done that for far too long and it hasn't gotten anybody anywhere. It's the revolving door of treatment. And so if somebody's, I tell people that's how I got my job at Northern Illinois Recovery, was a client saying, hey, do you guys run any groups on this topic? And they said no. And they reached out to me to come in and run that group. And so I think it's that continued openness to feedback. And, you know, sometimes it's coming from a barbed place. Sure. And some hurt and some other things, but there's a lot of value still in what that feedback is and kind of the underlying pieces where you can say like, oh, I can understand how it creates that experience, even if that wasn't the intention. So how could we go about it different?
That's a perfect segue into the unique programs that you offer at Northern Illinois Recovery. Since it's not one size fits all, I'm sure you're developing new programs. You probably learned a lot from clients who've come in and said, okay, now we need this or now we need that. So what's different? What are the programs you do that you want to tout?
So when we started out, we really were offering a partial hospitalization program. And so it sounds really scary. It's 5 hours of clinical program a day, so like a school day's worth. And one of the unique things we did at that point was we had a supportive housing component that really made that program stand out as different. There's a lot of folks who could benefit from 5 hours of therapy 5 days a week, but they didn't have a recovery environment that was going to be safe for them to keep living that out outside of those 5 hours. And so the supportive housing component was huge. And then we also provided intensive outpatient. And so it was a nice transition for folks into those lesser levels to start getting back into the normal swing of work and family and all that. But what we found over time was that our community in McHenry County, we didn't have any higher levels of care than that available. And so folks who needed inpatient care for residential or for detox needs, they didn't have any options nearby. And so when you talk about your moment of willingness,
like we have a new wing.
Yeah, and that was really it, was just community responsiveness. We found that people couldn't get access to the services in the moment that they were ready to make a change. And so they bailed on making a change. And we thought that's not going to work for people, you know, who medically were unable to come directly to us at that point. And so we opened up an inpatient center down the road and was the first one, still is the first one in the county to provide that level of care. And it's been huge. I mean, we're often sitting on a wait list for that facility because there's such a need in our area.
So all the stuff from the old days
is
not bad. There are certain things from the standardized cliched care that we know are good. I assume that's group and individual therapy.
Yeah.
Do you have standard groups that you do, or do you mix and match all the time?
I think there's always kind of some key components around what we're doing, and sometimes the flavor of it changes week to week and month to month. So we're always building in these components around holistic care. So I think the old model of all talk therapy all the time is something that we found is helpful for some folks and helpful at certain points, but they need some other things. And so the holistic components where you're doing art therapy and yoga and breath work, and we had an improv group going on at one point, just these ways to kind of get people open to alternative methods was really big for our program. And then we also provide these content groups or these curriculum groups, and those change a lot. And so some of those are really evidence-based, skill building, you know, DBT, we're talking about emotion regulation and mindfulness and all kind of some of the cliches, the staples of treatment, because they work, right? But then we're also flavoring some of these groups with, hey, we're going to talk about relationships, and that's going to dive into all kinds of areas in a lot of different ways. We're going to talk about grief and loss, and there's so many models for that. And so we'll kind of overlay those, and then we'll include all these process groups, right, which is the moment where I digest all this material I've been taking in and say, how does this work in my real life? How do I practice this?
Sure.
And so those kind of staples of our model of the holistic care and the processed opportunities and the curriculum, while they shift a little bit time to time, those are kind of the core for our program.
Science has always seemed to indicate in recent times that almost all of us have a trigger for addiction. Some of us biologically have a trigger that's more easily triggered, and that it is a disease and it needs to be treated with that sort of sensitivity and that sort of protocols of treatment, right?
Yeah.
But in the midst of knowing that and knowing that these triggers are out there, some of those things that you've discussed are really important, and I don't think they're discussed enough. So let me hit two of them here, because you brought them up many times, and I know it's prominent on the website at northernillinoisrecovery.com as well. Oh, and by the way, the number, again, I gave it to you before, but let me give it to you again, 779-600-2440. You can ask anything you want.
Anything.
And if you get surprised, it'll be a good part of your day. But you talk about trauma. You know, maybe somebody's been raped, or maybe somebody has been abused at home, or something else awful has happened. Maybe it's a car accident, whatever the case, maybe you have the chronic pain. What's the approach to trauma and trauma tied to addiction?
I think this is where the new approaches have really come in, is the reality that trauma fuels so much addiction. And it's not always the cliche traumas, right? Sometimes it's just, I grew up in this environment that I thought was normal. And then I was around the table with some other adult friends of mine, and I found out that everyone was appalled at what I thought was normal.
Sure.
And so I think we see a lot more of that, and it opens that door a lot. And this is kind of my area of niche. This is how I ended up at NIR, was because of my trauma background. But I started in adult addiction, and then when I pursued my master's degree, I moved into childhood trauma because the link was just so prevalent to me as I did my first sets of internship and all that, where I said, there's a link and we got to talk about it. So when it comes to treatment, you know, there's a really mindful scaffolding that you build around, does this person have the skills and the insight and the ability to do some of that bigger work? Because it doesn't look like a doorknob confession of, here's every terrible thing I've gone through. It looks like, hey, I've got to figure out how to inhabit this body that I've been at war with for a really long time and be okay with that space. So we talk a lot about top-down processing versus bottom-up processing, which is a really fancy term for, we can do talk therapy on it and then try to get down to the core of it, or we can start with like the body work, right? And this is where those holistic things come in. Is that sometimes folks who have gone through so much trauma and have been so disconnected and dissociated, that's the self-medicating part, right? Is like, I don't want to be in touch with that stuff. It's scary and I don't know how to deal with it. And so you take away a substance, you've got to replace it with some kind of skill to give them the space to re-regulate and be successful in then doing some of that trauma work. And so I think sometimes people jump the gun to that.
And the bereavement piece of this, I lost somebody I love. I don't want to go on. You know, but I'm still here, and I'm not going to kill myself. I'm not going to take my own life. But how do I move forward? Well, I'm just going to get drunk again, or I'm just going to get high again. That's got to be really difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you talk about grief as a society, we're not very good at it, right? Everyone sends an awkward sympathy card and says our condolences and kind of moves on because we don't know what else to say. And so I think what we're coming to realize is it's not about what you say, right? It's about making the space for somebody to sit in those feelings, to feel real bad about it because they need to, because you're grieving, and that's a sacred space. And so I think we do a lot of work around accepting the fact that feelings are just feelings, and not to minimize them, but just to recognize that like they're going to come and go, and it's okay that they continue to come and go, and that you continue to struggle with grief and loss 6 months from now, or that you have a craving a year from now. It doesn't have to mean what you might jump to make it mean, right?
Sure. And the victim piece of that, which I'm sure you see very early on, probably almost everybody, I can't believe this is my life. I can't believe this happened to me. I could be totally wrong, but I guess very few people come in, even when they're ready for therapy, and go, it's all my fault. It's not anybody else's fault. The victimization thing, is that a big blockade?
It can be. I think you'd be surprised how many folks walk in with this huge, dark, looming cloud of shame, though, too. Because I think some of them...
Is that helpful?
Kind of, right? As far as a motivator for change, people are a lot more willing to do something about how terrible they feel. But it can be a huge barrier for them because they're living under the weight of this thing they feel like they can't fix. And that they're facing all the dumpster fires that their active addiction created. And they're saying, this is all done for. And it's all my fault. And so I think oftentimes what we see, and this is some of the old treatment ways, is... let's use shame to motivate people. And we find out that that doesn't last, because if I continue to live under the shadow of shame the rest of my life, right, those are all going to be triggers for returning to use. And so when you talk about helping people in this realm, a lot of it is rebuilding a sense of self, self-trust, self-esteem, because they've been told by loved ones, by, stigma and that kind of thing, that like, you can't trust your own judgment. You are the captain of this ship and it's on fire, and that is what you're bound for forever. And so I think rebuilding a healthy sense of self is a big part of treatment, because they have to have autonomy. They have to be able to advocate.
Sure.
Because, again, they are going back into the wild of a culture that doesn't always support folks who are in recovery.
Fear of dying can be a motivator as well. Where do you cross over? And I assume you're going to tell me it's in the hard work done not just by your team, but also by the person themselves, from fear to hope. Because I think that's to me, that's the nexus, right?
Yeah.
It's, I'm afraid I'm going to die. I'm afraid this is never going to change. I'm afraid I'm not going to be successful. I'm afraid I'm always going to be an addict. But somewhere the clouds part and suddenly you have hope that you can get there.
Yeah.
Can you see, is that visceral? Can you see that?
I think that you can visually see this when you walk into a room with folks who first are coming into treatment, where they look like they are the most damaged person you've ever met, right? Because they're underneath the weight of all that stuff they're carrying. And they're starting to realize how heavy it is, because they're not using this exact moment and they can feel it.
Sure.
And so I think when you talk about fear and fear of dying, sometimes that's that first step for folks of, man, I got to change something. And then it's that transformational moment where they realize, I deserve for good things to happen to me.
Yeah, there it is.
And I think that's when you talk about folks who work like a 12-step program, they talk about the promises. And there's kind of this pivotal moment for folks where they go, I deserve that. I deserve to have the promises come true and for these positive things to happen in my life. And that's where that self-esteem part comes in, is until I'm done shaming myself about how terrible I've been in the past, I'm not going to be able to allow myself to have good things. And I'm going to sabotage that when it starts to happen.
So family and friends, and especially your old drinking or drugging buddies, they have to walk out the door with that belief that they can go somewhere and be fun without being smashed.
Yeah.
How do you know they're ready?
Oh my gosh. That's the scariest part for clients. They'll walk in and they will tell you their entire horrendous life history and everything they've done wrong. But the moment you tell them, like, let's try and do something fun together and just like get out of the comfort zone, that is the scariest thing you can ask someone to do in treatment, because it feels so much more vulnerable than sharing all the darkest parts, because I live in the dark parts, right? Like, that's my comfort zone. It's scary to allow myself to just be vulnerable and have fun and be light. And so I think one of the most impactful groups that we run is something called like Sober Fun and Recreation. And people always lift an eyebrow. Like, is that really therapy? Like, you don't know the half of it, because some of the hardest work happens in like letting you have a childhood and have friendships that aren't based on alcohol and drug use. And so I think when it comes to that, that's a big part of helping folks build their recovery community and their support network is, hey, what are your resources? Because maybe it's recovery meetings, and that's great, but what other kind of sober activities can you be a part of? I know locally we're really lucky. We've got a great nonprofit that has a sober bar, which is a whole lot more prominent now with...
I think you guys started the concept, and now everybody in the country does it like it was their idea.
I know. The Sober Curious
as
movement's
long as
huge.
they're helping.
Yeah. And so I think that's big, is that there's finally a cultural shift and an openness to the fact that you don't have to celebrate with a drink. You don't have to handle stress with a drink. You can do all that stuff at a coffee bar or hanging out with friends. And so we're starting to see this openness and this curiosity of a generation that says, I'm sober curious, and I don't know what's going to happen yet, but I'm going to see what comes next. And I think it's awesome.
So if you're a family member, a husband, a wife, a mom, a dad, an uncle, an aunt, or whatever, and you're an adult, and it's killing you to see what the person you love is doing, but they're not ready.
Yeah.
They're not ready to come in. Do you have resources for families who are in that spot?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I think is unique about us, our admissions team who's answering those phones are folks who are actually in our building on site. And so sometimes they'll reach out to our clinical team and say, hey, I had this person call in, they're looking for support, they live in this area, this is what they need. And so you've got all these really thoughtful resources prepared that are tailored to what folks are asking for, what they're saying they need. And so even if you're a family member and your person's not ready yet, but you're ready and you know you need something, give us a call, right? Because we can help support you in that process until they are ready.
And to the addict who is ready or thinks they're ready, who is scared, but they want to take that first step. Do they go to the website? Do they call? What do you recommend? Yeah,
the website or a call, whichever works. I know, comfort level for folks is a little different, but those same folks are going to answer that, whether it's through either platform, those same admissions folks, and they're going to be the ones who welcome you in the doors when you come in, and whether that's, hey, I'm coming in next week when I'm ready, or hey, can I get in today? You can always call, because we always want to be able to provide that support and make sure that you've got that moment where you're ready to make the next step in your journey.
All right, so before we wrap this up, I think that first day thing that we mentioned earlier, first 24 hours, what's that first day like?
So once you've got that screening and you're coming in to care with us, you're welcomed by a whole bunch of staff who are there to support your first steps. You're going to meet with one of our clinical team members. They're going to do a full assessment to understand your background, what's bringing you in, what's motivating you, what kind of things have you experienced. We use that information to get you linked up with the right therapist to start putting you into the right groups. And then you also have this kind of awesome check-in point. We've got a client engagement coordinator. And so this is the same person who runs our alumni program. And so on day one, they're going to check in with you, get to know you, and kind of be your support person through that first, especially that first week of care, just to say, hey, I'm checking in on you. I've got you on my mind. Wanted to see how you're doing. Can I reach out and let your family know how you're doing? And then they're kind of that neat opportunity at the back end too of, hey, remember that day one conversation we had? Like, here we are, and you've got all this time sober. So that's pretty neat for a send-off. And then you start to engage in that group process. You get your therapist will come and connect with you, introduce themselves, let you know when your first official therapy session is going to be, and get you rolling, because we find that
you'll have a sense of a plan.
Yeah, because I think what gets in the way for a lot of people is the waiting, right? And so very much we're doing stuff and we've got things to keep propelling forward instead of getting stuck in a space of I'm in my head and I'm having all these second thoughts and all that, right? You made it here, and that was the first hardest step. So what do we need to do next to keep you moving the same direction, even if it's baby steps?
Dr. Caitlyn McClure, you're delightful. I don't throw that word around lightly.
Well, thank you.
And it's a pleasure to spend some time with you, and I hope everybody takes the opportunity, even if you're just at the very bare beginning, of looking into it for somebody you love or for you.
Yeah.
You deserve a life. You deserve your life. So let's put the roadblocks aside and move forward. 779-600-2440, northernillinoisrecovery.com. Thank you for the time.
Awesome. Thanks so much.